Good morning. Thank you very much to Congresswoman Fox for welcoming us. We're grateful for the courage that she shows in reminding us that the Constitution provides constraints, and even more that those constraints, in fact, are limiting but also liberating. My name is David Bobb. I serve as director of the Allan P. Kirby Jr. Center for Constitutional Studies and Citizenship at Hillsdale College. We're pleased to welcome you all to this ongoing monthly lecture program called First Principles on First Fridays. Our mission at the Kirby Center is an extension of the educational mission of Hillsdale College, an institution founded in 1844. The Kirby Center is much younger. We launched only last fall. Our mission is to teach citizens, and included amongst citizens are students. Hillsdale is an undergraduate institution. To teach scholars as well, to work with statesmen and public servants about the enduring principles of the Constitution, and in so doing to inspire them, to inspire citizens to act worthy of the blessings of liberty. One of the focal points of the Kirby Center is the Washington Hillsdale Internship Program, a program that for 35 years has invited Hillsdale College students to Washington, D.C. for a semester-long intensive study abroad program. For when you are on the main campus of Hillsdale College in South Central Michigan, Washington, D.C. indeed can seem very much like a study abroad. I'm pleased to welcome 6 of Hillsdale's students who are here today, wrapping up their semester. As the 400 employees of Hillsdale College on our main campus have just concluded one of the coldest, most snowy winters on record, it's fitting that we would now turn to a discussion of hot air. In fact, today's topic is timely, important, and very pressing. For it raises the fundamental question of what framework our public policy questions will be decided in. Will that framework be one in which the Constitution is the guide, or will some other framework prevail? What, in short, does the Constitution have to do with environmental policy? Hillsdale College today is delighted to be able to call upon Steve Hayward to address this question. Few are more qualified than Dr. Hayward to do so. He has extensive experience in a wide range of public policy issues. Co-author of the annual Index of Leading Environmental Indicators, Dr. Hayward is the producer and host of a DVD I would commend to all of you. It's titled An Inconvenient Truth, or Convenient Fiction. It's a rebuttal of Al Gore's documentary. He's the author of many books on environmental topics. And each year he pulls together, as I mentioned, this Leading Environmental Indicator Index. He writes also for AEI's Environmental Policy Outlook series. And in fact, in addition to affiliations with many other think tanks, Dr. Hayward is the F.K. Weyerhaeuser Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. He's written widely on other topics, too. I commend those books to you, including one that you'll be able to find later this summer, the second in a 2-volume series on the age of Reagan. He's written on the topic of greatness. Today he's going to help us understand better Kyoto and the Constitution, environmentalism and the administrative state. Dr. Steve Hayward.
Well, thank you, David, and thank you, Hillsdale. I noticed on my way into town this morning the news that our president is in France, which somehow seems metaphysically appropriate. That's all I can say about that. Climate change is a big issue these days. I suspect that some of you have heard a thing or two about it in the news. But it is a confused and increasingly chaotic scene with many moving parts. Some of those parts moved afresh even this week. Now, I think the issue is changing in real time, right in front of us, but I don't want to get bogged down too far in the details and lose sight of the central point of this Hillsdale series, which is to highlight the constitutional defects of the modern administrative state. So there are 4 parts of this issue to consider this morning, and then in question period we can broaden it out if people like about curiosities about this or that aspect of the subject. The first part is this. Climate change is the central obsession of the environmental left today, and its sock puppets on the left in Congress. Churchill once defined a fanatic as someone who can't change their mind and won't change the subject. Well, the issue of climate change is mired in a monomania among the environmental left, both as to the nature of the problem and the range of possible responses to climate change of any dimension and from whatever cause. For the climate fanatics, change is always catastrophic, always immediate, always caused by humans alone, and can only be addressed by one remedy, huge and hugely expensive reductions in fossil fuel use. Well, the election of Barack Obama has not brought comfort and confidence to the ranks of the climate campaigners. To the contrary, there is right now an obvious sense of panic in the rhetoric of the climate campaigners, as I call them. And this panic arises not simply from the fact that the global economic crisis is derailing expensive climate action plans, but it's also from the deeper problem that the scientific case for catastrophic global warming is starting to unravel. After 2 decades of steadily increasing global temperatures from the late 1970s to the late 1990s, which on the surface seem to validate the basic theory of global warming, well, there's been no warming for the last decade, maybe even a slight cooling, depending on which data set you look at. Now, this was completely unexpected and is starting to falsify the predictions of nearly every computer climate model. Now, the climate campaigners are engaged in complicated contortions to explain away this inconvenient truth, but a few more years of flat or slightly declining temperatures, and the entire issue might start to turn turtle on. Meanwhile, many of the signs and wonders, as I call them, that are deployed to scare the public are in retreat as well. The Arctic ice cap bounced back last year after a record low level in 2007. And by the way, almost all the recent scientific research suggests that the decline in the Arctic ice cap we've seen in the last 30 years was caused by shifting wind patterns and ocean currents rather than greenhouse gases anyway. The decline in Greenland's ice mass, which had been observed by some data sets to have been accelerating early in this decade, has now stopped and reversed itself, according to Science magazine just 2 weeks ago. Ocean temperatures appear to be cooling, which confounds the orthodox warming theory, or at the very least suggests that our grasp of the issue is not as complete and definitive as the climate campaigners tell us. The data show that drought has not increased in the United States over the last several decades. And tropical storms have entered a quiet period over the last few years, again contrary to the rhetoric of Vice President Gore and the climate campaigners. So small wonder then that a whole raft of recent opinion polls by Rasmussen, by Gallup, from the Pew Research Center, show increasing public skepticism of global warming and declining enthusiasm for expensive greenhouse gas emissions reductions. In fact, just 2 weeks ago, in Gallup's annual poll on environmental issues, for the first time in 30 years, a majority of Americans say that economic growth should take precedence over environmental protection by a margin of 51 to 42%. The previous high water mark ever for people saying the economy should take precedence over the environment was only 44%. So despite the evidence suggesting that global warming is at worst an exaggerated or overestimated problem, the climate campaigners persist in demanding only steep and expensive near-term emissions reductions, even though there are other cheaper and more effective remedies, such as geoengineering, in the unlikely case that catastrophic warming were to come to pass some decades from now. And this monomania over emissions cuts is leading to demands for fresh distortions in our law, our policy, and in international diplomacy. And this brings me to the second main point, the fixation with the Kyoto Protocol, or what I call, to borrow Churchill's phrase about disarmament in the 30s, the prolonged and solemn farce of the Kyoto Process. The original Kyoto Protocol of 1998 is set to expire in another 2-3 years, and the global climate campaign is desperately wedded to the idea of crafting Kyoto 2 by the end of this year in Copenhagen, talks at which it is widely expected President Obama will attend. Now, the first Kyoto Protocol of 1998, which not even a President Gore would have implemented had he become president in 2000, has generated the greatest mass hypocrisy since the Kellogg-Briand Pact promised to end warfare back in 1928. I have little doubt that in 10 or 20 years, we're going to look back on the Kyoto Process as the climate policy equivalent of wage and price controls to fight inflation in the 70s for those of you old enough to remember that idiotic idea. The Kyoto approach has utterly failed to achieve its first stage goals. And the European claims that you'll hear sometimes in the press to have complied with Kyoto depend upon some bookkeeping gimmicks that would have made Enron blush. Now, there was never any prospect that the United States was going to agree or implement a treaty whose emissions reductions would have assured the acceleration of the relocation of American industry overseas. That's why even the most green and liberal members of the Senate voted by a margin of 95-0 for the Byrd-Hagel resolution in 1997, which said to President Clinton, please do not bring us a treaty that does not include the emerging nations such as China and India and Mexico and Brazil. And that's exactly the treaty that Al Gore brought back from Kyoto. As of this moment, it appears that any Kyoto II will have virtually the same defect, although we can expect some fancy footwork in Copenhagen in December to try and dress up or disguise that fact. Now, the basic political and economic calculations behind Byrd-Hagel are still in place today, despite changes in the membership in the Senate since 1997 that have moved that body to the left. Just this week, I noted the Senate passed a series of resolutions saying we want to have emissions trading or some climate policies that do not cost anybody anything. I noted that these passed on April 1st. I leave it to you to decide whether the Senate, in fact, has a sense of humor. Generally, you can answer that question in the negative fairly reliably. There's zero chance that a Kyoto II treaty can achieve the consent of two-thirds of the members of the Senate. Note, just to take one example, that Ohio's otherwise very liberal Senator Sherrod Brown has expressed his opposition to emissions trading because of its impact on Ohio's industry. So, the climate campaigners are arguing that President Obama should eschew the route of a formal treaty and instead pursue a series of international agreements in the form of executive congressional agreements similar to fast-track trade promotion authority that we used to do things like the NAFTA free trade treaty in the 1990s. What this would do is allow President Obama to pass binding international climate obligations that would piggyback on Kyoto II, but with only a simple majority vote of both houses of Congress instead of a two-thirds vote by the Senate. Well, there's several things to be said about this idea. First and most obviously, it shreds the constitutional provision for the advice and consent of the Senate. Now, the Supreme Court has generally avoided ruling clearly on the constitutionality of executive agreement format that we've used in the Trade Promotion Authority. I think the Supreme Court is likely to avoid the matter, or has so far, as being a political question to be worked out between the elective branches. However, and that's an important point, however, there's a very large substantive difference between bilateral trade agreements between the United States and one or two other countries that are designed to make both nations more prosperous, and an executive agreement with potentially 180 other countries that will make us less prosperous. And that would have significant economic costs. They're obviously very different animals substantively. Now, the leading advocate of the executive agreement approach to climate policy is a fellow named Nigel Purpose at the Brookings Institution, who wrote not long ago, quote, well, he's arguing that the treaty clauses of the Constitution are an impediment to progress. And here's his quote. The treaty process created by the framers of the Constitution requires an exceptional degree of national consensus that is no longer reasonable given the frequency and importance of international cooperation today. We must not cling to preconceived notions of how our country negotiates and reviews international climate agreements, close quote. The plain English translation is, if the Constitution stands in the way of a climate treaty, so much the worse for the Constitution. A similar dynamic is working itself out on the purely domestic level, which is the third moving part of this story. The prospects for the passage of an emissions trading reduction plan in Congress do not look very good at the moment for reasons I just mentioned, chiefly because too many Democrats in heartland states that would be hit hard by sharply higher energy costs are hesitating or openly opposing the idea. However, President Obama's budget plan has penciled in more than $600 billion in revenue from an emissions trading bill, from the higher costs we'd all pay on our utility bills and for gasoline and other energy. And hence the idea has been floated of attaching emissions trading to the budget reconciliation process, thus allowing it to be passed by a simple majority vote as a part of the general budget and making it immune to a filibuster in the Senate. This is obviously an attempt to end-run the deliberative process of the legislative branch. An emissions trading bill simply cannot survive the light of a sustained and open debate in Congress. So try and attach it and pass it without debate. Now, the idea of pursuing Kyoto 2 by means of an executive agreement or a domestic emissions trading scheme by means of the budget reconciliation process has stirred up some resistance among members of Congress who still take seriously the separation of powers and the prerogatives of the legislative branch. This is not a brand new idea, by the way. An episode that's mostly forgotten because it disappeared so quickly. Back in 1979, Jimmy Carter floated the idea of trying to adopt the SALT II arms control treaty by means of an executive agreement because of simple majority vote, instead of a formal treaty because he knew the SALT II treaty could never get two-thirds vote of the Senate. His members of his own party told him where he could put that idea, and he abandoned it, and ultimately abandoned the treaty, of course. And so the White House is backtracking on both ideas, but don't expect them to be entirely abandoned. Those are always go-to measures you will reach for in the middle of the night when you think no one is watching, and ram things through. Now, this brings us to the fourth and final piece of the story. Regulating greenhouse gas emissions through the existing mechanisms of the Clean Air Act, an approach that promises to fuel an enormous expansion of environmental bureaucracy on all levels of government, down to local government and state government. Now, the Clean Air Act of 1990 was an update of the original Clean Air Act of 1970, and it specifically targeted traditional noxious air pollutants that harm human health, like ground-level ozone, carbon monoxide, lead, sulfur dioxide, and nitrogen oxides. However, the Clean Air Act also provided some latitude for the EPA to regulate unspecified toxic chemicals that in small amounts contribute to pollution on the local level or pose localized health risks. Examples would be benzene or methylchloroform. But the Clean Air Act was never intended to be a vehicle for the regulation of greenhouse gases or the mechanism to fight global warming, and is not, as we shall see, suited to the regulation of greenhouse gases, which are of a quite different character from noxious air pollutants. In fact, during the congressional debate in 1990, it was deliberately decided not to include carbon dioxide among the pollutants the EPA should regulate. And indeed, it never even occurred to the regulation-happy Clinton administration to try and apply the Clean Air Act to this issue. Well, what happened is a sharp case study in the elasticity of power and the corruption of law in the modern administrative state. A few years ago, frustrated by the resistance of the Bush administration to the agenda of the climate campaign, environmentalists brought a lawsuit, it was Massachusetts versus EPA, decided about 2 years ago today, that sought to use the general language allowing the EPA to regulate newly discovered toxic pollutants in Section 302G, for those of you who like to look these things up. They sought to use that general language to compel the EPA to regulate, especially carbon dioxide, from automobiles. Essentially, the idea was it was a backdoor way of imposing higher gas mileage standards on the auto fleet. Well, 2 years ago, as I just mentioned, the Supreme Court botched the decision on the case, siding with environmentalists that the EPA could regulate CO2 as a pollutant if it made what is known as an endangerment finding under the Clean Air Act terms. An endangerment finding is a finding that greenhouse gases pose a threat to the health or welfare of Americans. That's step one of setting in motion the Clean Air Act process. Now, in so finding, the court disregarded its own precedents, most especially in a case a few years ago called EPA versus Brown and Williamson. This was about whether the FDA could regulate tobacco smoke from cigarettes. And the court said no, it couldn't. And some of its language in EPA versus Brown and Williamson suggested that Congress would not delegate major policy decisions of, quote, such economic and political magnitude, close quote, to an administrative agency in, quote, so cryptic a fashion. In EPA versus Brown and Williamson, we were also referring to some very general language suggesting that the EPA's authority over anything that might hurt you was boundless. And the court said no. But they said yes in the case of Mass versus EPA. Well, the EPA issued the endangerment finding just a couple of weeks ago, even though, and it'll probably run with this, even though the factual claims are all exceedingly weak. And so the long process of developing a regulatory regime under the Clean Air Act for CO2 is now underway. Well, now, ever since this litigation began, and even in recent weeks, since the Obama administration arrived in town, it was generally assumed around Washington that the threat of regulating greenhouse gases through the Clean Air Act was purely a political tactic designed to bring pressure on Congress to pass a more comprehensive and more flexible approach to greenhouse gas emissions reductions, like emissions trading, everyone's favorite market-friendly means of doing this. But with the prospect of emissions trading fading, suddenly it's becoming more likely that the Obama administration will use the Clean Air Act as a fallback position. And Congress may well acquiesce because it will excuse them of the responsibility for the high costs and chaos it may generate. Now, the irony here is that in Mass versus EPA, the court thought it unlikely that an endangerment finding would lead to, quote, extreme measures by the EPA. Let us see about this. Now, the litigants who brought the case purported to be seeking regulations only from automobiles, as I mentioned, but this is a disingenuous argument. Once a chemical compound is determined to be a pollutant under the terms of the Clean Air Act, a series of broad regulatory regimes for potential sources of CO2 going far beyond automobiles are set in motion, and by the way, any environmental group can compel them to be expanded and enforced through litigation. And this is already happening. Even before the endangerment finding has completed its formal review, and before the EPA has begun a long rulemaking process that often takes years, environmental groups are already going to court, are challenging permits for the construction of new coal-fired power plants or the expansion of existing coal-fired power plants, citing the Supreme Court decision as their basis. Now, there are two main features of the Clean Air Act that will come into play. First, the Clean Air Act requires the EPA to determine a National Ambient Air Quality Standard, NAAQS is the abbreviation, or NAAQS is the way it's pronounced. You're supposed to determine a standard, or a level for CO2 in the air that protects the health and welfare of Americans. For ozone, for example, to take a conventional pollutant, the standard is 0.75 parts per million over an 8-hour period. And there's a lot of science that shows that when it gets above that, certain sensitive people have impaired lung function and so forth. Fine and dandy. But unlike ozone, which is a local pollutant and an evanescent pollutant, it goes away overnight, CO2 levels are determined globally, not locally or within the borders of the United States. And if the climate campaigners believe that we're already above a quote-unquote safe level, it will mean the EPA will have to set a level where we are now or lower as a target. And even if the United States emits zero CO2, it would have no difference on the global level of carbon dioxide, meaning that it would not change the so-called danger to the health and welfare of Americans one little bit. Well, the second thing is taken to the extent of the law, the EPA will be empowered to regulate virtually every source of CO2, not just cars and trucks and power plants. For example, one important feature of the Clean Air Act is something known as the Prevention of Significant Deterioration, PSDs, it's called in the terms of the trade. And the PSD requirement means that any new major source of pollution or the modification of an existing source that might increase emissions of any pollutant must either adopt very expensive control technologies or that limit emissions or find some way to offset their pollution elsewhere. So, what is a major source of air pollution? Well, the Clean Air Act says it's any source that emits 250 tons per year, although in some cases it's as low as 100 tons a year. Now, that's a lot for things like carbon monoxide or ozone precursors like volatile organic compounds. It's hardly anything for CO2. That threshold is so low that it would cover most office buildings of any size, a large apartment building, strip malls, any building in Washington that uses fossil fuels to heat and cool itself will surely reach that threshold. That means that hundreds of thousands of buildings and businesses are potentially exposed to regulation through the Clean Air Act approach to greenhouse gases. And the PSD permit process is lengthy and expensive. And remember, it also allows third-party environmental lawyers to intervene relentlessly at every step of the process, increasing both costs and delays. For a look at what the future might bring, just look at my home state of California, which has perfected the art of regulatory expansion. Suppose, for example, in California you want to build a small strip mall or shopping center or office building. California regulators refer to such enterprises as indirect sources of pollution. Indirect because although the building may not emit any ozone or carbon monoxide itself, it attracts car trips See, so they have it's a destination for automobiles, and so they're allowed in the permitting process to build something now to take into account the indirect pollution that your building will be responsible for because people drive there. So they have a formal indirect review process in California. And they estimate the amount of pollution that will come from all these new trips of people coming to do business with you. And then they charge you a mitigation fee. It varies from county to county, but it's as much as 50 cents a square foot in some cases of your new construction. Now, this is called a mitigation fee, but it doesn't mitigate anything. It's simply more money to pay for a larger bureaucracy of the air districts in California. Recently, you may have heard California regulators proposed in the last couple of weeks to outlaw the sales of black cars in California on the theory that black cars absorb more heat from the sun in the summer and therefore use more gasoline to run their air conditioners. In other words, we have arrived at a place in which the regulators, armed with no affirmative statute or mandate from Congress, and with a policy framework designed for a very different kind of problem, finds itself limited only by its imagination, which, as we can see, is quite expansive, and with no effective constraints from the positive law or the Constitution. And this is merely one aspect of the modern revolution in government born of a series of, by now, very old errors in our constitutional construction that have delegated legislative power to independent agencies and eroded the separation of powers that was considered a key bulwark of liberty by the men who wrote the Constitution in 1787. This is a long and complicated story that defies simple solutions or easy remedies or the mere reversal of just a handful of Supreme Court precedents. Above all, the root of the administrative state we see galloping along at a quicker pace even before President Obama came into office is a set of ideas of progressive government that sees the Constitution's meaning as unfixed, to be determined by the tides of history, which somehow always seem to be running full in the direction of increasing government control over people and enterprise. At some point, we need to engage in serious thought about reforming administrative law, reforming regulatory procedure, with new limits on congressional delegation, new rules on standing for third-party intervention, and generally about the nature and limits of government power in a globalized world of advanced technology. I'll close with this. Thank goodness we have Hillsdale College to help carry on this important work. Thank you. And now we'll do questions and whatever else. Who wants to go first? No one ever wants to ask the first question. I always try to plan one, but I got here too late this morning. Yes, sir.
All right, well, you planted one at the end. What is the likelihood of being able to reverse some of these? What is the likelihood of being able to reverse some of these decisions, allowing departments to just regulate out of thin air, to just all of a sudden decide, you can't have a black car anymore.
Yeah.
Some of these decisions that are ongoing, the EPA. What's the likelihood of ever getting back into that?
Well, I study these matters. I'm not a lawyer, but I study constitutional history and the way these things work. I think it's a mistake to think that the courts are going to fix it with 2 or 3 more good appointments. We're all for that, but I think Congress. Especially Congress needs to assert itself, and the current Congress won't, obviously, because they like all this stuff. But Congress at some point needs to assert itself and rewrite some basic regulatory statutes. A few things that nearly happened in the 1990s. One little thing that was a partial victory was requiring agencies to use more robust cost-benefit analysis, so that if you're going to impose a regulation, the benefits should be higher than the costs. Because otherwise, on the environmental level alone, if you're wasting money, you're wasting resources, which probably is not good for the environment at the end of the day, and it's very hard to get through to orthodox environmentalists. So I think that Congress needs to reassert itself. The executive branch can also try this. The book I have coming out in the summer about Reagan talks a lot about their initiatives to try and discipline the bureaucracy, which was a mixed success because sometimes they fell victim to bad court decisions from Congress, which was hostile to some of these reforms, and the media, which was always against them. So it's a hard problem. But don't go embracing the simple idea that we just get a new case and a new justice on the court, that will fix everything. It will help, but the problem is deeper and requires, I think, forward action from the other branches first. Someone else? Yeah. Well, you go first.
What do you think that the spike that puts global warming hoaxing to bed will be? Is there any one event or study that could put the monster back in its cave?
No. I didn't use this in my text. I didn't put it in my text, but I thought about putting in there that it's amazing to see I follow public opinion polls closely, and it's amazing to see public resistance rising to all this. After people like Al Gore have spent literally hundreds of millions of dollars in public education and advertising campaigns. They've got the worst product since the Edsel. The Edsel was a more successful marketing effort than this has been. So I think, if you want to point to some things, they thought Hurricane Katrina was their breakthrough moment, and they're still dining out on that, and it really wasn't. And the reverse would be, if we have some more really cold winters here and around the world, I just think it's going to erode more and more. And what's happening on that is really fascinating to watch. The so-called mainstream scientists have been publishing a series of studies in the last year saying, we think now maybe global warming is going to pause for 10 or 20 years. And this goes completely against the theory that says it should be, what's happening right now is all the models. You take all the suites of models they run, they say temperature should be doing this, and they've been going like this, and so now we're way below the lowest bound of all the main models. That continues to go on, and pretty soon you can't keep this up. So I don't think it will ever be a decisive moment when you say it's over. You may, on the policy front, see a few nations abandon their crazy commitments. Some of the Europeans are close to that, actually. But I think the trajectory of this issue is going to follow the trajectory of the population control movement of the middle part of the 20th century, which is still around, but nobody pays that much attention to it. And even the UN 15 years ago said population is now a less important issue than we once thought it was. And there's a great book on this out last year called Fatal Misconception by a liberal historian, actually, at Columbia University, published by Harvard University Press. And if you read this, this guy went through all the files of the population control organizations, International Planned Parenthood, and what he showed was the self-dealing and political corruption of these groups, total disregard of the facts. And as you read this, if you just swap out climate change for population, it reads like a perfect description of the whole climate change game going on with the UN's IPCC today. So I think it's going to grind along for a long time, but I think it's, or the other marker I sort of think about is, Time magazine, whenever it's stuck, puts climate change on its cover. They've done more global warming covers than any other magazine. Well, at the end of last year, the magazine trade publishing people, whoever they are, the little survey discovered that the green issues that everybody puts out in April were the worst-selling newsstand issues for everybody, Vanity Fair, Time, everybody else. One of these days, the editors are going to get in their meeting at Time magazine, if there still is a Time magazine that prints on paper, and someone's going to say, we're stuck for a cover. Someone will say, let's do global warming again. And one of the older editors is going to say, that's not. Because we don't do covers on population bombing anymore, which you remember back in the late 60s, it was huge. Right? And so I think it's going to slowly fade away. It will never go away, but it's going to slowly fade away. And, all these climate groups are going to take on the character of the World Esperanto Association. It'll be hard, yeah.
So there was a full-page ad in, I think it was the Post this week on Monday, Kyoto ad with all these scientists co-signing. It's questioning, essentially, that whether or not the climate is actually changing and warming, which I thought significant, but I'd love to know your thoughts on it. And then the second question is, so do you think a climate cap-and-trade bill will actually pass the Congress and get signed by the president?
The sort of establishment on this is so, as I said in my remarks, is so caught up in monomania that no amount of... Freeman Dyson was on the cover of the New York Times Magazine last week, and he's a famous lefty. You couldn't get any better crime credentials than him. And, he's a skeptic on all this, quite openly, saying this is all nonsense. And, you read what goes on in the blogosphere. It's like, first of all, there's two reactions to this. Is, what's wrong with Dyson? Well, he's an old man, so he's obviously senile. And the other one is why would the New York Times do that to us? That was the other. It's supposed to be a monopoly on this. So, good for Cato for doing that. I don't think that has much effect, unfortunately. I don't think an emissions trading bill is going to pass unless it's completely phony and does nothing. In other words, I'm actually going to spend I'm going to ruin most of the rest of my day reading through the Waxman-Markey bill that came out earlier in the week. There's two things notable about it. One is it's called a discussion draft. You always know when something's called a discussion draft, I don't think it's going to get through in anything resembling that form. And second, it leaves completely vague all the big questions as to how many emissions allowances are you going to sell or give away, and that's what the whole game is, really. And how are you going to try and keep people from noticing they're paying higher energy costs? And no one can figure that problem out because it can't be figured out. So I think they're going to say, we'll need to put this off till next year.
You'll be the only one that has read that document.
What's that, you are?
You will be the only one. No legislator will before they vote.
At least it's not going to vote. At least it's in big print, so I don't know. But that's why this whole business, the whole EPA, there is one sentence in the Waxman-Markey bill that would remove from the EPA the authority to regulate greenhouse gas emissions under the Clean Air Act. Well, this is interesting. Congress should have done all along. And so that's a sort of an odd little thing that's floating out there. I'm not quite sure who that's trying to bait. They might think there must be a handful of Republicans who will fall for that trick. But that's why now this idea that we regulate through the Clean Air Act, which, is, as I've tried to describe in a couple of ways, is completely inappropriate to this problem, setting aside the nature of the problem and so forth. That's looking now more likely. And then that'll allow President Obama to show up in Copenhagen saying, we are going to do something about it. We're going to use we're going to use a bill that was first passed by, a law passed by President Nixon and had long bipartisan support. It's been effective for everything else. We'll say things like that. And, the Europeans might buy that. But of course, it can take 10 years for a major rule regime to get through all the procedural hurdles you have to go through under the Clean Air Act. So if I'm an environmentalist who seriously thinks this is a problem, this really isn't a very good answer, because it's going to mean years and years of delay and lots of contentiousness, and so this is a huge mess. But you had your hand up, I think, didn't you? Or one of you did? Okay, good. You.
Some people have said that journalism died in the 2008 election, and probably most people in this room think there's media bias.
Yeah.
Some people have said that the journalism has died, that it's dead in the 2008 election. Most people in this room probably think there's media bias. How do you grade right now the media, the journalists, and over the next 10 years, where do you think, what grade would you give them then? What is your prediction?
Media coverage of environmental issues generally gets an F. That's a gentleman's F. It's just so bad. It's the worst of anything. Boy, I don't know. I'd go on a long time about that. Will it get any better? I don't know. It's not a thing. The problem with environmental journalism is you have the true believers who go into it because they want to save the world. They're going to be Woodward and Bernstein for the environment. So they're ideologically ill-disposed to any fair reporting. Then you have other people who end up in the beat because no one else in the paper wants to cover it. And they actually literally draw straws. And who gets the short straw has to cover the environment. This is actually the Washington Post. Their reporters are usually a political reporter who has to do environment for a while. They're not any good at it. The New York Times, at least, has reporters with serious credentials. Andy Revkin, really knows a lot about science, and they've got a few people with PhDs in sciences on their pages doing reporting. And so their reporting in the ordinary sense is better, and that it's more balanced and more serious and has somewhat more depth to it, even though Revkin is totally in the bag of the alarmists. You at least can have a sensible conversation with him. We're sometimes talking to, I won't mention the names of the Post, but one lady who's been covering the environment is like talking to a child. It's just impossible. And then the story comes out completely distorted and biased. And so I don't know if that'll change or not, because especially with media organizations shrinking, and with the fact that beyond the small number of people who are fanatics about the subject, most people don't find the subject very interesting. Reader surveys and all the polls, the Pew poll in January, gave people 20 issues. So global warming was mentioned as an issue for importance. It came out 20th. Well, this is not lost on editors. And so I don't know if it'll ever get any better. Now and then you might find a contrarian reporter who decides to, that there's an opportunity to go the other way. The New York Times had a guy in 1992 named Keith Schneider. He did a 4-part front-page feature series about, unorthodox views of the environment. It was quite a good series from my point of view, and he got drummed out of the Times pretty fast. I mean, that was just politically or environmentally incorrect, as I call it. There's political correctness, there's environmental correctness, and it's still got a real stranglehold over the coverage of this. So, you have to be almost bulletproof like John Stossel to be able to report in the contrary fashion and survive very long in the newsroom. So I don't know.
He hasn't received any awards recently.
No, but he gets big contracts from his broad because he gets ratings, and that that still speaks a lot for in the media world. He always just threatens to go to another network if the network, ABC jerks him around, and another network would grab him in a second. So, yeah.
In follow-up to that, who's going to wind up finally punching through the media to win the battle? I mean, just as with the Dan Rather, George W. Bush assassination in the election season that they had, they can only get so far out on this limb until it's either going to rot and break on them or somebody's going to come in behind them like the bloggers did and saw the limb off.
Yeah.
And penetrate that thing. And I can't recall the name of the guy for Newsweek, but he was up here in a briefing on the Hill on the Senate side, and he said, the only climate denier that we're going to talk to is Senator Inhofe. The rest of them, forget them. So Dr. Lindzen, who at MIT is off the list. You who are doing the same thing that the IPCC did, except accurately reporting on the full scope of the literature, you're off the list. But at some point, something's got to penetrate this, and it'll knock it down. So put on your Swanee hat and tell us who finally gets through.
Well, let me talk about the population parallel again. I actually think this was the turning point in this country. It was about 1970 or 71. President Nixon appointed a commission to investigate population problems. Should the U.S. have a population policy? This was the cover stories. The Rockefeller Foundation was pushing this behind the scenes, and you had the whole the UN population people were at high pitch in the early 70s. Paul Ehrlich's book had been a 30 million copy bestseller in 45 languages or something. So they started saying, well, yeah, maybe we need to have some kind of fertility policy in America. No more than 2 children per family. And somebody at the meeting raised their hand and said, have you noticed who that's really going to affect the worst? Well, minorities. That commission was never heard from again. And it went away at that. They made that thing go away so fast because it was politically incorrect, right? Well, I think the similar dynamic is playing out now. My observation when I testified in the Markey Committee a few weeks ago as the Republican witness, and what was amusing, how this works, you have 3 majority witnesses and 1 or maybe 2 Republican witnesses. And what I observed about this was 2 things. One is it really was to stare into the pit of despair for a lot of the Democrats on what they even know about the subject. But the world's coming to an end tomorrow, and if we don't do something really big right now, we're all doomed. That's pretty close characterization of what most of them said in their opening statements that go on forever, right? But the second thing was they were utterly terrified of voting for a bill that's going to cost anybody anything. And the funny thing is that I won't go through all the details of this, but the Democratic witnesses were actually unhelpful to their case because they're saying, well, we need to have rebates to people. And the utility companies are saying, give us the rebates and we'll pass them along to customers. And a lot of them, yeah, sure you will. We trust you on that one. Hadn't worked that way in Europe. You had Fred Greenstein from the Center for Budget Priorities saying, let's just give rebates directly to consumers. And that's where I said, how are you going to do that? Your consumers in Washington State that has low carbon energy will make out like bandits because their rates won't go up at all. They're the lowest rates in the country for all the hydropower. And their rates won't go up at all, and so they get a windfall. Whereas people in Indiana, Ohio, Kentucky who have coal-fired electricity, their rates will go up a lot, and you won't keep them whole. And you can see the wheels turning. How's that going to play in a congressional district in the Midwest that Congressman X voted to give money to those people sipping coffee and listening to grunge rock in Seattle? See? And at the end of the hearing, it was quite clear that there's, I think that's where this issue turns around in policy and political terms. The science is going to take forever to slowly, as I say, erode away, I think. But now, the game is, are you really going to cast a vote? And you watch the Obama people; they're backtracking so fast, telling the Europeans, "We're not sure we can match those targets." The Obama people are saying the kind of things that whenever the Bush people said it, they were called every bad name in the book, right? But now they're saying the same thing because they're staring some reality in the face. So that's where I think it starts to turn. Someone else? Let's see. Let me get over here and then do him and then Randy.
What's going to happen to all the trash that's in the budget that they're about to vote on today?
Oh, I have no idea. I mean, that's,
Will that get cleaned up as some of those costs taken out of it as it is implemented?
Yeah, I have no idea. I'm not a budget expert. It just seems difficult to me. I mean, I have talked to a couple of people in the agency, career people I know, who say they're doubling our budget in 1 year. Says we have no idea how we can spend that kind of money, let alone spend it sensibly. I mean, so there are going to be some scandals out of all this, and to actually try and spend it all. Gentleman in the back had a question, and then Randy's going to tell me I'm being too optimistic, probably.
Sir, the global population effort didn't have the same kind of extensive regulatory and legal structure that the environmental movement is. So when the environmental movement hopefully does get pushed off the stage, how do you sort of undo all of this infrastructure that's sort of cemented in there?
Yeah, that's going to be very hard. It's going to take... Well, let me just step back and say that, right now, especially among conservatives, the urgent topic is, how do we oppose this enormous explosion of government we're seeing right in front of us? There are a few of us sitting around saying, yes, that needs to be done, but we also need to think about how do you govern next time you have the opportunity to govern, and you don't squander your opportunities, as I argue the Bush administration did in the last 8 years. That's why I'm so interested in the Reagan experience, because they understood the problems and tried some solutions and made some progress in some and not in others. And so, if there's ever another chance at that. So the point is, the answer to that question is wrapped up in some larger questions of reform that goes across the board. And I say those are hard. I mentioned just in the briefest outline, we need to rethink the question of delegation of essentially lawmaking authority to independent agencies on all kinds of things. I don't know, there's this train wreck going on right now with the Consumer Product Safety Commission. It's implementing a statute that Congress passed, but was so badly thought through that, you can't entirely blame it's like the IRS. The IRS says, we're just implementing the tax code Congress hands us, which is right. So I don't know. Those problems are, big problems that require a lot of serious thought and a lot of blueprints before you actually get another conservative administration, it seems to me. Because by then, if you're 6 months in and still appointing people, it's too late in some senses. The Reagan people at least came into office with a plan, as I say, some of which worked, some of it didn't. And that experience needs to be thought about and emulated and improved upon. So that's fairly general and not good enough, but that's the way we ought to be thinking about this long term. We need to take the long view of some of these things. Randy, you had a question. Let me get you the microphone, because they won't hear you. They're still building this place?
They're still paying for it.
Yeah, of course. Right.
Mr. Obama says a lot about transparency. It's kind of an all-show or no-go position, but how do we use transparency, given your thoughts on we need more exposure to what's going on out there? How would you use transparency to really open this debate up, either on Capitol Hill or in the media or the public? Give me your thoughts.
Yeah. Well, I suppose there's the Data Quality Act, which I'm not really an expert about. But some of these, I don't know. I'll give you a good example. The endangerment finding the EPA has just done on this, saying, carbon dioxide is a danger to the public health. Even on the alarmist's own terms, if you accept the orthodox theory, you're decades away from any of those harms. Those harms don't exist right now, which is unlike traditional air pollutants, where ozone really does harm you right now. And so Pat Michaels at Cato has done a magnificent takedown of all the claims that they're saying are harmed right now, diseases and all kinds of, his filing to the EPA was 300 pages long, I think. You can get it off Cato's website, and I recommend it to those of you who work on all this. What's the old Mark Twain line, or whoever it was? I got my mind, don't confuse me with the facts, I got my mind made up regular. I think you just, we have to be like, ankle-biting mosquitoes or something, constantly prodding the National Academy of Sciences and the Climate Change Science Project and all these folks to poke holes in their data. The media does not pay attention to that, is not interested in it, and I think most people in the public don't really have the the interest in following that closely, for actually very sensible reasons. Why do I want to, if I'm an ordinary citizen out in countryside, why do I want to spend a lot of time on the internet reading up on this when I can be watching something fun on TV or playing with my kids? There's some sense to all that. I think the much better approach is the political one of, I think we need to piggyback these Tea Party people. And you want to go to meetings of your member of Congress and just simply ask the question, why do you want to raise my energy prices? Just do that. And, eventually, they'll stewing their own juices on the other parts of it. I do have some confidence in science. I mean, it's badly politicized, but it is an iterative process. You do see, I try to follow as much of the peer-reviewed literature as I can, and you see every week heterodox or contrarian findings being published. At some point, that's going to tell, I think. I will tell you one other story. I do know this was off the record, so I shouldn't say his name, but I do know a leading climate scientist at one of the major institutions who's a moderate. I mean, he thinks this might be a very serious problem, but he's honest enough to say, I don't really know. There's so much we don't know that we shouldn't be going off half-cocked. He doesn't like Gore, even though Gore has cited him. And so he's one of the leading universities. He says, my single biggest problem right now is getting graduate students in physics, the top ones, to go into climate science. I was astounded to hear that with all the money sloshing around. I said, well, why not? It's just because they all think it's a dead-end subject. They don't like how politicized it is. They think it's a lousy career path. And he says, so if you look closely, a lot of the people who publish in this field are not really physicists or, honest-to-God, climate scientists. They're biologists, ecologists, people who change from the softer disciplines. That, I think, is going to catch up to it at some point. I thought that was really fast. This is a guy who's been doing climate science for 30 years. Been doing this a long time. And I just thought that, I'd never heard this before. I thought that was an astounding thing for one of the top guys who's a straight shooter in the ordinary sense of the subject to say. But that's where it is. So
we're going to have to close it out.
I think Member Fox has a question. Yeah.
It seems to me, based on what you were saying and based on my observations here, that one of the best things that could be done would be somebody like AEI or Cato to do an evaluation of many of these regulations and put a dollar figure to them.
Yeah.
I've heard for years that regulations have driven up the cost of a home 30%. Unnecessary regulations. Yeah. I think if we could have somebody do a serious study of the cost and present those and get them out, it would be one of the most important things that could be done, because the American people really do pay attention when you show them how much something costs. And I think being able to take this term cap and trade and call it cap and tax has been a very, very useful thing to have been able to do in terms of getting people's attention. So if you all could come up with a way to do that and say, this is how much the EPA Clean Air Act is costing you as an individual, it would be very helpful.
Yeah, and where that works on this game is, by the way, something I learned actually from one of your new colleagues, Tom McClintock, who I've known for years in California.
Who's terrific.
Yeah, well, you know what, his say simple gimmick, that sounds pejorative, it's not. He makes the point, and especially these days of $1 trillion deficits and $800 billion bailouts, you say that something costs the country $200 billion. It's sort of an abstraction. What's that? He always translated into costs per household. This regulation will cost each family in California $800. Now, when the Clean Air Act costs people that amount, but it's embedded in all the costs they don't see. But people do see their utility bills, and they see the price on the gas pump every week. That's why this issue works for us better than some of these others. So that's why I always say is don't use those my eyes glaze over numbers that we all use on Capitol Hill. Use the per capita or per household number. And that's why it happened. We and others have been doing some work on how much is going to raise your utility bill depending on what scheme you use. And I think that's what's frightening so many of the Democrats is they realize you can't hide those costs. You can't say the estimate's wrong because you will actually see it on your bill. So, yeah, more power to you. And, where we're going to be doing, me and others are going to be, the problem is with Waxman-Markey, when they don't specify how many of these things are going to be auctioned or given away and what the backfill mechanism might be, it's very hard to reliably estimate. So you got to give ranges. Anyway, I'll stop there. Thank you, Jenny. Thank you all.
presentation of a lot of information, very complex and difficult to follow, very simplified. Thank you. And we're really glad it's going to be eventually available on our podcast. That we're getting better and better. Be patient with us as we get a website up and give these things more air, and more people will be able to view your talk. Thank you, Steve. And thank you, Virginia Fox, for hosting us today. We really appreciate your presence and your leadership, especially on the Rules Committee, where you continue to ask very tough questions and show amazing principled leadership, very creative leadership. And we really appreciate what you're doing in Congress for all of us, whether we're from North Carolina or not. Let me just mention as we depart today that we have two future events. On the 15th of April at 11 o'clock at the Hotel Phoenix, which is steps away from the Union Station Metro, we'll have a book event with Mark Levin. It's going to be limited space, so it's filling quickly. If you're interested in coming, please make sure you're RSVP'd with our office because it is filling up fast, and he's got a very hot book, Liberty and Tyranny, right now. Our next event for the First Principles on First Fridays will be with R.J. Pistrito, and it's going to be compliments of Grover Norquist at the Americans for Tax Reform. It's, again, right off the Metro this time. So we appreciate everybody going on this scavenger hunt with us month by month around the city and the area, finding good speakers and good company, and we encourage you to do that. Take a look at the Krauthammer article op-ed today. It casts the Constitution as the one that's being forgotten in the midst of the agenda in town, so it's very clear, very good, very appropriate for this group. Linwood.
Will Mark's books be available for purchase?
Mark's books will be available for purchase. He won't have time to individually sign them, but he's going to give us some book plates to use that day. Thanks for asking. Have a great weekend, and thanks for joining us so early.